Mute from the massacre, starving in the woods, a Lakota chief found her and gave her voice back. I found her on the second morning after the snow stopped. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was following a bull elk I'd been tracking since before first light, reading the pressed grass and the drag mark where one back hoof had gone soft on him. My horse Chanwapaha felt it before I did. He threw his head sideways and blew hard through his nose, and I pulled him up and sat still and listened. Wind off the ridge, a magpie working something in the scrub oak to the west, and under all of it a sound I couldn't place at first, low and thin, like a branch under snow weight, but not quite that. I rode toward it. She was in the hollow behind a fallen cottonwood, down on her hands and knees in the crust, her fingers blue where they dug at the bark. She was trying to eat the bark. Her dress was torn at both shoulders, no coat, no hat, her hair frozen into plaits against the side of her face. She didn't look up when I came through the brush. She didn't look up when Chanwapaha stopped 3 feet from her and stood breathing steam down at the top of her head. I got down slow, spoke quietly, not to her but just to put sound in the air to let her know something was present. She stopped digging at the bark. Her hand stayed flat against it. She still didn't look up. I crouched down where she could see me without turning her head, and I waited. A long time went by. The magpie came and sat in the cottonwood above us and made its noise and left. The elk was gone. None of that mattered anymore. She turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in that light, and they didn't show the fear I expected. What they showed was something further past fear. The place a person arrives at after fear has burned through them and left nothing but a flat, cold quiet. I had seen that look before. I knew where it came from. I took off my blanket and set it across her shoulders. She didn't pull away. That was the first thing. I am Thathanka Ska, white bull in your tongue, though no one who knew me well called me that. Among my people I was just Ska, or more often just the chief, said the way you say the name of something you know the full weight of. I was 41 years old that winter. I had been leading my band for 11 years, since my father died of the spotted fever in the summer. His horse herd went to 60 animals, and he never got to see it. I had a son, Chayton, who was 14 and already better with a bow than I'd been at 17. I had lost my wife, Winyan Washte, good woman, to a difficult birth 3 years before, and I had not taken another. Not from grief alone, though there was grief. More from the understanding that I didn't have room in my attention. Leading the band through those years took everything I had. The army was pushing north. Not an active campaign that winter, but the pressure you can feel building before a storm breaks, the patrols riding further, the surveyors appearing in places surveyors had no business being. I had kept us out of the trouble that had taken other bands, through patience, through choosing ground carefully, through never doing the thing the army wanted me to do, which was give them a reason. My men thought I was cautious. Some of them thought cautious was another word for afraid. It wasn't fear. It was arithmetic. I knew what we had and what they had, and I knew what would happen if I let it become a war. That didn't make it easy to hold. It made it the hardest thing I did every single day. I tell you this so you understand what kind of man found her. Not a young man with fire left to burn. A man who had already done his burning and come out the other side into something harder and colder and more useful than fire. I carried her in front of me on Chanwapaha because she couldn't hold herself upright. She didn't fight it. She was too far gone to fight anything. I could feel her ribs when I got my arm around her, the way they moved when she breathed, and I could feel the cold radiating off her skin right through the blanket. It was 4 miles back to camp. I kept the horse at a walk, talking the whole way, not at her, just talking the names of things we passed, the creek under its ice, the shape of the ridge against the sky, the way the cottonwoods grew here because the water ran close to the surface. In my own language mostly. It wasn't for her to understand. It was for the sound of it, the steadiness. We came into camp mid-morning. People stopped what they were doing and looked. I told Hahala, my sister, to get water heated and get food ready, something light, not too much. I told her to find dry clothes. Hahela looked at the woman in my arms the way my sister looked at everything, with her own opinion fully formed and not yet decided whether she'd share it, and then she went. I took the woman into my tipi and set her near the fire. Hahela came in behind me with a clay pot of warm water and a piece of dried meat softened in broth. The woman sat where I'd put her, the blanket around her shoulders, and stared at the fire. Hahela held the pot out toward her. The woman didn't move. I took the pot, dipped my fingers, touched the back of the woman's hand to show her it was warm. She looked at my hand. Then she took the pot in both of hers slowly and brought it to her lips and drank. She drank all of it. Hahela took the pot and went out for more. I sat across the fire from the woman and we stayed like that. After a while she looked at me. I said my name, said it slowly twice. She opened her mouth. I could see she was trying to say something. What came out was nothing, just breath, shaped into the beginning of a word that never arrived. Her face tightened. She tried again. Nothing. Her eyes filled but didn't overflow. She closed her mouth and pressed her lips together hard and looked back at the fire. I didn't try to fill it. I just sat there and let her be quiet. Some silences you crowd out because they make you uncomfortable. Some you hold because the other person needs to feel you can carry it with them. I knew how to hold a silence. It was maybe the most useful thing I knew how to do. Her name, we learned eventually, was Clara. Hahela found that out 6 days later when Clara scratched it in the dirt near the fire. We knew already she wasn't stupid. She was watching everything, her eyes moving constantly, taking in the camp, the people, how things worked. Not the watching of a frightened animal preparing to run. The watching of someone who is learning, cataloging, deciding. She had been part of a wagon party of 7 families. They were heading north, looking for land. The Lakotas who hit them, I knew which band it was, a younger man's band, hot-headed, making choices I hadn't been able to stop. They hadn't left anyone, or they'd thought they hadn't. Clara had been underneath the wagon when it started, putting grease on an axle. She'd gotten under the wagon bed when the shooting began and stayed there still, not making a sound until long after it was over. I don't know how long she was in that hollow before I found her. By what she looked like, I'd say 4 days, maybe 5. That whole time she didn't make a sound. Even when she was near death in the cold, she was quiet. Her voice hadn't been taken by anything medical. Hahela had a good sense for injuries, and she found nothing wrong with the woman's throat. Her voice was somewhere she'd put it, somewhere deep down, after what she'd seen. Locked in with everything else she'd locked away so she could survive. I didn't try to unlock it. You don't force a lock like that. You wait until the person on the inside decides to open it themselves. What I did was go about my days in her presence. I want you to understand what my days were. I was up before first light. I had the camp's problems always. There is no end to a camp's problems when you are responsible for 83 people through a hard winter. A man whose horse had gone lame and needed a new one from the string. 2 families with a dispute over a hide curing agreement from the summer that no one could now agree on. A young man who wanted to ride south and join the confrontations down there and needed to be talked out of it without having his pride stomped flat. That was 3 conversations, not 1. The scouts' reports to hear and consider. The state of our stores, which were not good. The weather. Clara started coming out of Hahela's lodge, where she slept early in those first weeks, and she would sit near wherever I was working. Not close, always with a few feet of space and always where she could see the way out, but there. I noticed she was watching how the camp ran, how I resolved the disputes, how the scouts reported to me and how I questioned them. I caught her watching once when I was working through the store count with an older man named Tehinchma. He had the memory for numbers and I trusted him on it, and she was watching our hands, the way we used them to count and illustrate, and her face had that focused, absorbed look. I started narrating, quietly. In Lakota, then pieces in English when I had them, mixing them, not worrying about whether she understood all of it. This is how many, this is how long, this is the problem with the trail west of the ridge. Just talking. The way I'd talked on the horse coming in. She started to nod sometimes. Not because she necessarily understood, just because she was tracking the rhythm of it, following. 3 weeks in, I was going through the saddle on one of the spotted mares, checking for sores, and Clara came and stood nearby. And then after a few minutes she came and stood on the other side of the horse, and she put her hand flat on the mare's flank, like she was learning the temperature of it. The mare turned her head and looked at her and went back to eating. Clara kept her hand there. I kept working. After a while she moved around to my side and watched what I was doing closely. The way I ran my fingers along the spine, feeling for heat or swelling, and then she put her own hand there, mirroring mine, a few inches back from my fingers. I moved my hand forward, she moved hers forward. We went over that whole horse together, without either of us saying a word. When we were done, I straightened up and she straightened up and she looked at me across the horse's back, and something in her face was different. Not fixed, not healed, just present, like she'd come back into herself a little bit, just in that small space of doing something useful alongside another person. I nodded at her, she nodded back. I went to the next horse, she followed. My son Chayton did not know what to make of her. He was 14, with his mother's straight look and my stubbornness, and he had opinions about most things that he stated plainly, which I had encouraged because the other option was a boy who kept his opinions buried until they came out wrong. He told me, about 2 weeks into Clara being in camp, that he thought it was strange to keep a white woman here. That people would talk. I said people were already talking. He said, but what do we do with her? I said we don't do anything with her. She's a person, not a thing to do something with. He thought about that for a while, the way he thought you could see him turning it, looking at the facets. Then he said, is she going to stay? I didn't answer because I didn't know. What I knew was this: there was nothing to send her back to. The nearest settlement was 3 days' ride in winter conditions, and sending her there alone was sending her to die. Sending her with a Lakota escort was more likely to get her shot at the other end than helped. And who was waiting for her? The family she'd had was in the ground. The people in whatever settlement I might send her toward. They had no claim on her any more than I did, and they had less reason to keep her safe. She was here because here was where she'd survived. I told Chayton, she stays until she can go safely. What comes after that is her choice. He nodded. He went back to work on the bow he'd been shaping. After a moment he said, without looking up, I think she understands more than she shows. He wasn't wrong. The hard weather came in earnest in the 5th week. 3 days of driving snow that kept everyone inside, kept the horses close, burned through our wood supply faster than I liked. The 3rd day of it I was alone in my lodge with the accounts I kept, not on paper, but in my memory, in a system my father had taught me, the kind of counting that lives in patterns rather than marks on a page. I was running through the stores, working out how long we could hold at current consumption before I had to make decisions about the horses, and it wasn't a comfortable set of numbers. Clara came in. She did this sometimes now, she'd ask, by pausing at the entrance and waiting, and I'd nod, and she'd come in and sit near the fire and do whatever she was doing. Hahala was teaching her to work hides. She was good at it, careful with her hands, patient. She sat down and looked at me. I was running the numbers out in my hand. 5 fingers, a count, tap to the knee, start again. She watched, then she pointed at my hands and pointed at herself. I looked at her, she made the gesture again, like she was asking, let me try. I started from the beginning, slowly. The base count, the categories, the way the multiplication works. She watched. Then she started doing it with me, her hands following mine, making mistakes, backing up, trying again. The storm was loud outside and we sat in the firelight and worked through the whole store count together. She had a gift for numbers. More than a gift, she had a way of seeing patterns in them that I didn't have, a quickness I noticed immediately. About halfway through, she started getting ahead of me, and I let her. I watched her hands moving through the count, confident now, checking back against the previous figures in a way that caught two mistakes I'd made in my own reckoning. She caught those mistakes and she looked up at me, her eyes uncertain, like she expected me to be displeased at being corrected. I pointed at the mistakes and made the right count and nodded. Her chin went up a little, not pride exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been told without words that what they know matters. I went back to the count. She stayed with it until we'd worked through everything, and when we'd finished, she had the whole picture of the stores more clearly in her head than I did in mine. I knew this because I started asking her questions, pointing at categories, asking for the count, and she answered with her hands quickly and accurately. We were short, not dangerously, but close enough that I'd need to send men out before the next hard stretch. She saw that too. She looked at the figures spread between us, and then she looked at me with a level expression, not worried, just clear-eyed about what they meant. I told her what I'd decided, even knowing she couldn't answer. I talked through the whole plan, which men, which direction, how long, what I expected them to bring back. Like talking to Tehinchma or one of my experienced men, not explaining myself to her the way you'd explain something to someone you were helping. Talking it through the way you do with someone whose judgment you're checking it against. She listened to all of it. When I finished, she sat for a moment, and then she nodded, once, the same way my senior men nodded when they'd heard a plan and found it sound. I sat with that for a minute after she went out. A long time since a person had made me feel like my thinking was being genuinely weighed. 2 months in, she had found her place in the camp's work. She helped Hahala with the hides. She'd learned enough Lakota to manage most practical tasks, and she'd become, quietly, the person I thought through the supply problems with. Every few days I'd lay out whatever the current numbers were, and she'd work through them with me. She was faster than me at the counting and better at spotting where assumptions were soft. I was better at the context, the weather patterns, the hunting signs, the diplomatic picture, the human piece. Together we covered more ground than I did alone. My men noticed, not with hostility, most of them. Tehinchma, who was not young and not easily impressed, told me one evening that the white woman thought like a man who'd been running a camp for 20 years. He meant it as the highest compliment in his vocabulary. I told him so, that she thought well, and left it there. She had started to come to the council fire. Not to speak, she couldn't, but to sit at the edge and listen. I allowed it. When I watched her face during the debates, I could tell when she had a view. I started watching for those expressions, and sometimes after the council, when we were going through the numbers, she would indicate something, point towards something, make a gesture of disagreement or concern that mapped onto exactly what she'd been watching in the debate. She had a political mind. She understood that what was said at the fire wasn't always what was meant, and she was reading it. I found this interesting in a way I hadn't found things interesting in a while. My sister Hahala came to me in the 8th week and closed the tipi behind her and stood with her arms folded and looked at me. I said, "I know what you're going to say." She said, "You don't, because what I'm going to say will surprise you." I waited. She said, "I like her, that's the surprising part." I expected not to. She works without complaint, she's respectful, she watches before she acts, and she's good for you. I said, "Good for me how?" Hahala said, "You think out loud again. You didn't after Winyan Washte died. You went inside yourself for everything. It made you efficient and it made you lonelier than you admitted. You're thinking out loud again with her and it shows. You're lighter." I didn't say anything. Hahala said, "That's all I'm saying, she's good for you. What you do about that is your problem." She went out. I sat there for a while with that. Lighter, I hadn't had a word for it, But when she named it, I recognized it. The way a thing you've been feeling unnamed suddenly has its shape when someone puts words to it. Yes, lighter. Like some weight I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing. It had shifted an inch or two. That wasn't a small thing. The first time I heard her voice was in the middle of the night. I was asleep in my lodge, or most of the way asleep, that thin layer you rest on when you're a man responsible for a camp in winter, and your attention never fully lets go. I heard it through the hide wall from Hahela's lodge next door, a sound, unclear at first, that pulled me up out of sleep before I decided to move. I was outside in a few seconds, cold air hitting me hard, and at Hahela's entrance I stopped and listened. It was Clara, not screaming, not the sharp sound I'd expected, something lower, a sound working its way up through her like she was pulling it from far down. Formless first, then shaping then. Her name, her own name, broken across 2 or 3 attempts. Clara. I stood outside in the cold and listened to her find it. Hahela's voice, low and calm, talking her through it. Clara trying again. Clara. There it was, whole, a word with all its pieces. Then something else, something I couldn't make out, softer. I went back inside, sat by the fire, didn't go back to sleep. In the morning I didn't say anything about it. I went about my work and she came out of Hahela's lodge pale and quiet, and with her eyes ringed from a hard night, and she went about her work. We sat together at midday with the numbers, as we had been doing, and she made a small motion with her hand that meant she'd caught something in yesterday's count that needed adjusting. And then quietly, without looking at me, she said it. 2 words, my name not White Bull but Ska, the short name, and a word in Lakota that she'd learned from Hahela. Ska Falamye. Ska, thank you. Her voice was rougher than I'd expected, like something long unused. It had a low register to it, careful. She still wasn't looking at me. I said her name back, Clara, then hey waste, it's good. She looked up then. I will tell you what I saw in her face when she looked up. I will not make it into more than it was. What I saw was a woman who had been reduced to almost nothing, not just by the massacre and the cold and the hunger, but by some longer story I didn't have all of, the way she held herself sometimes, the watchfulness, and who had come back to herself here in this camp, working beside me. What I saw was someone who felt herself to be of use, who felt seen, not as a survivor to be managed, but as a mind worth thinking alongside. I knew what that looked like because I had needed it too. She talked more after that, not freely at first, carefully, like a man who's been out in the cold learning to use his hands again near the fire, testing, finding what worked, stopping when it didn't. Hahela helped her, the 2 of them spending evenings together where the only goal was sound. Clara's Lakota was coming along. She had an ear for it, a musician's ear almost. She got the tones right before she got the words right, which is the harder thing. By early spring, she was talking at the council fire. Not at first with words. For weeks she just caught my eye when she had a view, and I started, without thinking about it much, pausing in the debate to give her the chance to signal. My men accepted this because they had come to accept her slowly, through the winter, through the practical competence that is the coin that buys respect in a camp where everything is real and nothing is theoretical. Then one evening a dispute over trail rights with a neighboring band was being argued, and I watched Clara's face change. She had something. I could see her working out whether to say it. She said it. In Lakota, careful and exact, she made the point that the 2 bands' traditional trail times didn't actually overlap because of the elk movement pattern, which she had been tracking in the counts through the winter. If you moved the contested window by 2 weeks, it solved the problem without either band conceding anything. The fire was quiet. She was right. She was demonstrably, numerically right, and she said it plainly without decoration, the way a person with real confidence in their thinking speaks, and the silence that followed was not a hostile silence but the silence of men turning over a thing that hadn't occurred to them. I said, "She's right." Tehinchma said dryly, "I know she's right." The matter was settled. After the council, Clara stayed near the fire after most had gone. I was banking it, getting it settled for the night. She was quiet. After a while she said, in a low voice in English, she still switched to English sometimes when she wanted precision. I didn't know if I should have spoken. I said, "Why did you?" She thought, she said, "Because it was the right answer and you needed it." That was the whole of her reasoning. I set the last piece of wood on the coals. I said, "That's the right reason." She looked at the fire, a long moment, then Chante Chilepi. "You are dear to me." A phrase you can say in many ways. To a child, to a friend, to kin. She said it looking at the fire, not at me, and I let it sit. I said it back, looking at the fire too. That was the second thing. The spring came slow that year. The snow went from the flats before it went from the ridges, and for a few weeks the world was half white and half brown in a way that felt suspended, like something waiting to break one way or the other. I told Clara one morning that she could go. The trail was clear enough. I had men who could escort her to within a day's ride of the nearest settlement, and the soldiers who'd been moving through the previous fall had pulled south for the winter and not come back yet. The window was safe. She listened to all of this. Then she said, "I know." I said, "I thought you should know it was possible." She said, "I've known it was possible for a while." I waited. She said, "I know what I'm staying for." The way she said it, I understood she wasn't asking me to respond to it. She was telling me a fact about herself, the way she told me facts about numbers directly, without decoration, because that's how real information is delivered. She was staying. She had decided. I stood there for a moment with that. I said, "Hahala will be difficult about the wedding." She said, "Hahala has been planning it since February." I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in some time, the kind that starts in your chest before you can stop it. Clara was smiling, that small smile she had, and the spring light was in her hair and her eyes. We were standing outside my lodge and the camp was going on around us. People moving, horses, the sound of the creek running under the last ice. My son Chayton went past with a load of wood and pointedly didn't look at either of us, which meant he'd been expecting this longer than I had. She came and stood beside me. She put her hand on my arm, not tentatively. Just put it there, the way she'd put her hand on the horse's flank that first time, sure of her right to be there, checking the temperature of a thing. I put my hand over hers. I will not gild it. That was what it was, a man and a woman standing in the spring light, her hand on his arm and his hand on hers. My camp around us. My son trying to pretend he wasn't watching. The creek doing what it does when the thaw finally comes. She said quietly, "Say something in Lakota, something I don't know yet." I thought for a moment. I said, "Chante Chilepi Snai Snai." More than dear to me. She turned that over, working out the grammar the way she did. Then, Midakui Oyas adjective I ink. She'd heard it at ceremony. All my relations, the phrase that means everything is connected, everything related. I said yes, that too. She leaned against my shoulder, just briefly, and went back inside to start work. We were married when the cottonwoods flowered. Hahala had in fact been planning it since February, and the ceremony she'd arranged was the real thing. None of it shortened or modified. None of the old words dropped. Clara had learned what she needed to know for her part of it, and she delivered it in Lakota with that careful precision of hers, and my people heard her say it, and they knew she'd learned it with full intention. Tehinchma said afterward, in his dry way, that she was the best thing to happen to the store count in his memory. Chayton, who had spent the entire winter pretending to have no interest in any of this, shook my hand the way a man shakes another man's hand, and looked me in the eye with his mother's straight look and said, I knew you needed someone to check your arithmetic. I said, your mother would have liked her. He thought about that, he nodded. At the fire that night late, after most had gone to their lodges, Clara sat beside me, not performing anything, not celebrating, just sitting the way we'd been sitting together all winter over the numbers, easy in the quiet. She said, do you know what the first thing was? The thing that made me stop being afraid. I waited. She said, you sat down in the snow next to me and you waited. You didn't try to help me. You just waited until I was ready. Nobody had ever done that for me before. I sat with that for a moment. I said I wasn't sure what else to do. She said it was everything. The fire burned down. The camp was quiet around us. Somewhere out past the lodges, Chanwapaha moved in the line with the other horses, that particular sound a good horse makes when it's comfortable and the night is still. Clara's shoulder was against mine. I felt the warmth of it, not the cold ward warmth of someone near a fire, but the warmth of another person close enough that you can feel they're alive. 41 years old, and a hard portion of them spent getting where I'd gotten, carrying what I'd carried. Holding the line, running the arithmetic, talking men out of the decisions that would get them killed, learning to move around grief the way you learn to move around a scar that won't ever fully go away. I had not expected this. I didn't say that. You don't need to say the things that are already fully present in the air between you and the person beside you. The coals went orange, then dark red. She was still there,